What is unfolding in the Persian Gulf now cannot be understood through the language being used to sell it. And the longer that language survives, the more dangerous this crisis becomes. Let me be very clear about something. What you are watching unfold in the Persian Gulf right now is not a blockade. It is not a strategic campaign. It is not a clean demonstration of American military power. What it is, in reality, is one of the most elaborate acts of mass delusion this country has produced since the early days of Vietnam. And having been inside the system, having sat in the rooms where these decisions are made, where the language of power is carefully manufactured before it ever reaches the press, I can tell you this with absolute certainty. The people running this operation either know they are misleading the American public, or they are so dangerously incompetent that the distinction no longer matters. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand what the mainstream conversation is still missing. But about what this entire episode reveals about where American power actually stands in the world today. And that picture is far darker than anything you are being told. Let us start with the blockade, because this is where the deception is most visible and most consequential. The United States Navy has deployed roughly 3 carrier strike groups into the region. That sounds enormous. It sounds overwhelming. It sounds like the kind of force package that should be able to seal off Iranian maritime movement and strangle Tehran's economy into submission. But when you move past the headline number and look at the operational reality, the entire image begins to collapse. Each carrier strike group carries between 3 and 4 escort vessels, destroyers, and cruisers. Add the amphibious readiness groups. Then subtract the carriers themselves, because no one is going to pull a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier alongside an Iranian oil tanker for a boarding operation. What you are left with is approximately 11 ships actually capable of boarding and interdicting vessels. 11 ships. Against the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Against a maritime space through which, since April 15th alone, somewhere between 100 and 200 Iranian vessels have reportedly been moving in and out. The math is brutal. On a good day, the United States may be interdicting perhaps 10% of Iranian maritime traffic. On most days, it is likely closer to 3%. And even that limited interdiction is constrained by geography and risk. The Navy is keeping its ships roughly 200 miles offshore of Iranian territorial waters because anything closer places those vessels inside the effective range of Iranian anti-ship missiles. That means Iranian vessels can simply sail within Iran's own 1-2 mile territorial limit, remain inside a boundary no American captain is likely to cross, and continue moving. The oil has been moving. The oil is moving right now. What people do not understand is the scale of what Iran has already put in play. By the latest available figures, Iran had approximately 150 million barrels of oil already out on the open seas, pre-sold and moving toward buyers at roughly $140 per barrel. You do not need a degree in economics to understand what that means. That is approximately $21 billion in revenue already locked in, already flowing, and already beyond the reach of any blockade the United States Navy currently has the capacity to enforce. So when the Treasury Secretary talks about having a foot on the throat of the Iranian economy, understand what that language is. It is theater. It is made for television. It is designed to convince the American public that maximum pressure is working when the operational picture tells a very different story. The Iranian economy is not suffocating in the way Washington wants you to believe. It is under pressure, yes. It is wounded, yes. But it is still breathing. And as long as Iranian oil continues to move through routes the United States cannot fully police, the blockade remains less a decisive military instrument than a political performance. But the farce of the blockade is only the opening act, because we are now at day 60 of this conflict. 60 days. That matters because 60 days is the threshold that triggers obligations under the War Powers Resolution. Now, I want to be direct about what that resolution actually is, because there is enormous confusion about it in the public debate. The War Powers Resolution is, constitutionally speaking, a deeply flawed instrument. It was always an attempt by Congress to get the best of both worlds, to criticize a conflict if it went badly, while preserving the ability to claim credit if it went well. It appears to constrain presidential power, but in practice, it often does the opposite. It gives presidents a framework to report, reinterpret, delay, pause, restart, and redefine military action without ever truly surrendering control. Every administration understands this. Presidents reset the clock. They declare a pause. They announce that a conflict has concluded. Then they wait, reframe the operation, and begin again. That is precisely what the current administration appears to be contemplating now. And this is where the situation becomes far more dangerous. The military commanders in the region, including Admiral Cooper and his staff, have reportedly counseled against further operations. Their assessment is straightforward. The United States has done what can be done from the air. Additional strikes will not achieve the stated strategic objectives. They will consume weapons that are already in limited supply. They will carry escalation risks that are not justified by any achievable military outcome. That is the professional military judgment. But there is another data point that should concern everyone watching this crisis. The movement of Special Operations Forces into the region has accelerated significantly. Not only SEAL Team 6, but conventional SEAL units and elements of Delta Force units that are not traditionally part of routine special operations contingency planning for this theater. There are also reports of serious planning for ground operations targeting nuclear material. And when you load a gun at that level, institutional momentum becomes very difficult to reverse. The gun is loaded. The question is whether anyone in a position of authority has the strategic clarity to set it back down. Most people assume the military will slow roll the order. They assume commanders will delay, bureaucracies will create friction, lawyers will raise concerns, and the clock will run out. But that assumption ignores one central fact. The president has already demonstrated that he is willing to override the counsel of his senior advisors. The decision to launch the original strikes on February 28th was reportedly opposed by many of the people in the room. He ignored them. There is no reason to believe that dynamic has changed. And now we have another element, a phone call from Vladimir Putin, initiated by the Russian side. That is not a small detail. Great powers do not initiate presidential-level calls casually. Putin does not call simply to make noise. The warning reportedly delivered was unambiguous. Keep your forces away from Iran. Russia has positioned itself firmly behind Tehran. Whether that warning was received in any meaningful operational sense is another question. Because what I know from having watched these structures operate is that warnings from Moscow are often filtered through an ideological lens that treats Russian statements as inherently bluff-oriented, inherently deniable, and inherently performative. That is a dangerous way to think in a moment like this. Putin does not place a warning on the record unless he has already calculated the next move. The Kremlin is not merely reacting to escalation. It is preparing the diplomatic and strategic predicate for its own response if escalation comes. That is how serious states behave when they believe a conflict is approaching a new phase. And here is where the administration's most dangerous assumption enters the picture. Washington appears to be operating on the belief that Iranian leadership is in disarray, that the strikes have paralyzed decision-making in Tehran, that the regime is fractured, confused, frightened, and close to collapse. That assumption may trace directly to Israeli intelligence assessments passed through liaison channels. But when you look carefully at the composition of the current Iranian leadership, that assumption becomes deeply questionable. President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Arakchi, the relevant IRGC commanders, the supreme leader's inner circle, many of these men are products of the Iran-Iraq war. They are not soft technocrats who have never seen existential danger. They are combat veterans, institutional survivors, and men shaped by one of the most brutal wars of the late 20th century. They built the institutions they now lead under conditions of siege, bombardment, chemical attack, isolation, and enormous national trauma. The idea that these men are paralyzed, confused, or ready to capitulate is not an intelligence assessment. It is a fantasy. It is the kind of fantasy governments tell themselves when they need justification for a decision they have already made. And there is another miscalculation here, one that every serious student of strategic bombing history should understand. When you bomb a population, you do not necessarily fragment it. Very often you unify it. The Blitz did not break the British. The bombing of Serbia did not topple Milosevic on Washington's timetable. Shock and awe in Iraq did not produce the grateful, liberated population its architects imagined. And strikes on Iran, especially strikes near civilian-adjacent infrastructure, are producing exactly the kind of rally-around-the-flag effect that history would predict. There are reports of ordinary Iranians, including people who were deeply skeptical of the regime only months ago, now standing behind their government. Not because they suddenly love the Islamic Republic, not because they have forgotten repression, corruption, or economic failure, but because the human response to foreign attacks is not abstract. When bombs fall from outside, national identity hardens. Fear turns into anger. Internal criticism does not disappear, but it changes its immediate target. This administration may have handed the Iranian government a political gift at precisely the moment it wanted to weaken it. And if that were the only mistake, it would already be serious. But the economic dimension may be even more consequential. The official Pentagon estimate for the operation sits somewhere between $25 and $28 billion. Other informed estimates place the real number closer to $50 billion. The United States has reportedly lost at least 49 aircraft. A single recovery operation for one downed crew member cost $500 million in aircraft losses. 2 radar installations destroyed by Iran in the opening days of the conflict were worth more than $1 billion each. Now put that into the broader fiscal picture. When Donald Trump took office, the national debt stood at approximately $37 trillion. By the end of 2025, it had grown by another trillion. In the first 77 days of 2026, it grew by yet another trillion. The debt is now approaching $39 trillion and accelerating. The interest alone on that debt is consuming a structural portion of the federal budget. In any rational system, that would trigger a serious reassessment of priorities. But the economic consequences are not abstract. They are already hitting American households. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is being drawn down to suppress gas prices, and it is not working. In Florida alone, gas prices reportedly increased 40 cents in 3 days. A tank that cost $21 a few months ago now costs $52. That is the kind of price signal no administration can spin away. People feel it at the pump. They feel it in grocery stores. They feel it in rent. They feel it in mortgage payments. They feel it when every supply chain touched by energy becomes more expensive. The Strait of Hormuz has been functionally compromised. Reports suggest thousands of ships are stuck or delayed near the strait, and thousands of mariners are facing shortages of food, water, and basic support. That is not a minor disruption. That is a structural shock to global trade. And what comes next could be far worse. If Iran escalates to a second tier of targets, oil infrastructure, regional energy corridors, export terminals, pipelines, and the choke points through which a meaningful fraction of global petroleum supply moves, then we are no longer talking about recession risk. We are talking about depression risk, and I do not use that word lightly. A depression not confined to the United States, a global depression. Because energy markets cannot be quarantined, the global economy is too interconnected. Every country that believes it can watch this conflict from a safe distance is fooling itself. If the strait goes, the shock moves everywhere. Manufacturing slows. Food prices rise. Inflation accelerates. Central banks hesitate. Debt costs climb. Governments lose fiscal space. Political instability spreads. That is not a regional conflict anymore. That is a global economic event. And this brings us to the central truth that Washington does not want to say out loud. The United States cannot win this war in the way this administration appears to define winning. I do not mean that politically. I mean it militarily. Take every war plan currently sitting on the shelf at the Pentagon. Take every contingency plan for every conflict scenario. Execute all of them simultaneously with the full weight of American military power behind them. Even then, you cannot compel the outcome Washington seems to believe is achievable. Iran is not a small country. It is more than 2.5 times the size of Texas. It has strategic depth. It has a large population with a demonstrated ability to absorb pressure. It has missile forces capable of striking American installations across the region. It has proxies and partners positioned across multiple theaters, and it sits beside the Strait of Hormuz. That geography does not go away because Washington wants it to. No amount of air power changes the fact that Iran can threaten the strait. No amount of political rhetoric changes the physics of naval vulnerability in a confined maritime space. No amount of televised toughness changes the limits of American coercion. The United States can punish Iran. It can damage Iran. It can destroy facilities. It can kill commanders. It can impose pain. But punishment is not victory. Damage is not a strategy. And escalation is not control. That is the lesson this crisis is teaching in real time. The blockade is not sealing Iran. The strikes are not breaking the regime. The economic costs are not contained. The military options are not producing a clear end state. The war powers clock is being managed, not obeyed. Russia is warning. Iran is hardening. The American public is paying, and the administration is still speaking in the language of dominance, as if language itself can reverse the facts on the water. That is why this moment feels so dangerous. Not because the United States lacks power, it has enormous power, but because power, without strategic clarity, becomes a liability. A carrier strike group is powerful, but it is not a political solution. A bombing campaign is powerful, but it is not regime control. Special operations forces are powerful, but they are not an exit strategy. A blockade is powerful only if it can actually block. And right now, the gap between the image of American power and the operational reality of American power is widening by the day. That is the real story of the Persian Gulf crisis. Not that America is weak. America is not weak. But America is discovering that its strongest instruments no longer produce the clean outcomes its leaders still imagine. The world has changed. Iran has learned. Russia is watching. China is watching. The Gulf is recalculating. And the American public is being asked to believe that a partial blockade, expensive strikes, rising gas prices, legal evasions, and widening escalation risk somehow add up to strategic success. They do not. They add up to a warning that the United States is drifting toward a war it cannot define, cannot afford, cannot cleanly win, and may not be able to stop once the next trigger is pulled. That is why the loaded gun matters. That is why the movement of special operations forces matters. That is why Putin's warning matters. That is why the war powers clock matters. That is why the blockade's failure matters. Because every one of these pieces points in the same direction. The system is moving toward escalation while pretending it is still in control. And the most dangerous wars are not the wars leaders choose with full understanding. They are the wars leaders slide into because every previous mistake makes the next mistake feel necessary. That is where we are now. The blockade is theater. The costs are real. The assumptions are collapsing. And the next decision may determine whether this remains a disastrous, limited conflict or becomes something far larger, far darker, and far harder to stop.